Okay, guys, today we're going to move on to chapter 5, 1 Timothy. I'm going to go ahead and read the whole thing, and then also I'll be going over the first couple verses of chapter 6, so we'll read into that too. But we'll read the whole thing right now, and then there's going to be one particular section of this that is what we're going to be focusing on today. So open up chapter 5, 1 Timothy. Never speak harshly to an older man, but appeal to him respectfully as you would to your own father. Talk to younger men as you would to your own brothers. Treat older women as you would your mother, and treat younger women with all purity as you would your own sisters. Take care of any widow who has no one else to care for her, but if she has children or grandchildren, their first responsibility is to show godliness at home and repay their parents by taking care of them. This is something that pleases God. Now a true widow, a woman who is truly alone in this world, has placed her hope in God. She prays night and day, asking God for his help. But the widow who lives only for pleasure is spiritually dead, even while she lives. Give these instructions to the church so that no one will be open to criticism. But those who won't care for their relatives, especially those in their own household, have denied the true faith. Such people are worse than unbelievers. A widow who is put on the list for support must be a woman who is at least 60 years old and was faithful to her husband. She must be well respected by everyone because of the good she has done. Has she brought up her children well? Has she been kind to strangers and served other believers humbly? Has she helped those who are in trouble? Has she always been ready to do good? The younger widows should not be on the list because their physical desires will overpower their devotion to Christ and they will want to remarry. Then they would be guilty of breaking their previous pledge. And if they are on the list, they will learn to be lazy and will spend their time gossiping from house to house, meddling in other people's business, and talking about things they shouldn't. So I advise these younger widows to marry again, have children, and take care of their own homes. Then the enemy will not be able to say anything against them, for I am afraid that some of them have already gone astray and now follow Satan. If a woman who is a believer has relatives who are widows, she must take care of them and not put the responsibility on the church. Then the church can take care of the widows who are truly alone. Elders who do their work well should be respected and paid well, especially those who work hard at both preaching and teaching. For the scripture says, "You must not muzzle an ox to keep it from eating as it treads out the grain." And in another place, "Those who work deserve their pay." Do not listen to an accusation against an elder unless it is confirmed by 2 or 3 witnesses. Those who sin should be reprimanded in front of the whole church. This will serve as a strong warning to others. I solemnly command you, in the presence of God and Christ Jesus and the highest angels, to obey these instructions without taking sides or showing favoritism to anyone. Never be in a hurry about appointing a church leader. Do not share in the sins of others. Keep yourself pure. Don't drink only water. You ought to drink a little wine for the sake of your stomach because you are sick so often. Remember the sins of some people are obvious, leading them to certain judgment. But there are others whose sins will not be revealed until later. In the same way, the good deeds of some people are obvious, and the good deeds done in secret will someday come to light. All slaves should show full respect for their masters so they will not bring shame on the name of God and his teachings. If the masters are believers, that is no excuse for being disrespectful. Those slaves should work all the harder because their efforts are keeping other believers who are well loved. Man, you get really thirsty when you read big old long chapter sometimes. Okay, so what we're primarily going to be focusing on in this chapter this week is the majority of it, honestly, which is about widows. But first, he starts off the chapter talking about Paul commanding Timothy how he should interact within his church. And if you look back to chapter 4, and this was something Colin was talking about, at the end of chapter 4, verse 11, he says, "Teach these things and insist that everyone learn them. Don't let anyone think less of you because you are young. Be an example to all believers in what you say, in the way you live, in your love, your faith, and your purity." He starts out here by saying, never speak harshly to an older man. Treat these women as you would your mother. Treat these women as you would your sisters. Treat the older man as you would your father. So Paul's command to Timothy is right in line with what he was just saying before about being the example for his church, and how he's supposed to interact so that he can be respected in everything he does. My Bible says speak harshly, but I know that some of yours might say rebuke. Rebuke, and it translates to like lash out. So when my Bible says speak harshly, it's if Timothy is correcting someone, Paul says to do it basically in a respectful way. Like, he's not saying that he shouldn't correct an older man or whatever. He's saying that he should treat him with love, but like be able to do that, like be able to speak against something that's wrong or something, but do it in a loving and respectful way. So the first couple verses of chapter 5 is right in line with what Colin was talking about and what it says here in chapter 4. And it's just a command to Timothy from Paul. So then we get into this, 17 verses or 15 verses or whatever about widows. And I have to be honest, it took me like a couple days of solid reading it to even begin to try and pull something relevant out of it. And it's, again, this is just for me. I don't know how you guys respond when you read that, but it's boring. But I think that's exactly the problem and the point of what I want to get to eventually today. Why some of us, or why myself, views that as boring, and how not appropriate that is. So, yeah, and it's not something, and it's a big deal. It's a big deal. This isn't the only time in the Bible that Scripture addresses widows, It's all over the place. It's in the Old Testament, it's in the New Testament. Christ interacts with widows a certain way. The prophets were interacting with them a certain way. God specifically is pleased. It says right here in the passage, God is pleased when we treat them a certain way. So it's a big deal, and it should be seen as a big deal, in how we interact with them. Secondly, one of the main themes that we'll address or whatever, or continue to hit on throughout the month is just the way in which the church is to be treated and cared for as a family. And he even starts out by commanding Timothy to treat it that way. Treat these people like your mothers, your fathers, your mothers, and your sisters. So there's an underlying theme in this chapter and in this book throughout multiple times, actually, where Paul is commanding Timothy to treat it as such, as a family. Okay. So first I kind of want to go verse by versage or whatever, a couple verses at a time, just sort of the context, because there was sort of an underlying attitude maybe that was happening at the time, and there's specific context for some of the verses here which are important to understand. So I want to make sure that that's made clear when we're studying this chapter, and then I'll try to do it as seamless as possible. It's not my forte, but try to make it relevant for you guys and what the attitude or mindset should be for us, even though Paul was speaking to a specific attitude at a time. And you have to remember, this is the beginning stages of the church and when things were being set up. And so when he's saying here in a detailed list that widows shouldn't be taken care of unless this, and this, this is the formative years of the church and setting things up and making sure that people are doing the right thing and following Christ's example in all that they do. So you have to keep that in mind. Okay, so it's specific. Lost my train of thought. Hold on. Okay. So it's specific to family. It's, the command here is that people who have widows or these people in their family units, they should be first and foremost taken care of by the sons and daughters, it says. And that's one of the like the Ten Commandments, and it's addressed in multiple areas. Honor your father and mother, so Paul is setting this up within the church so that the church basically is not being responsible for something that we as believers and as family members of these specific people in need, the church is not being primarily responsible for that because it has to address all these other issues. So Paul is telling Timothy to make it clear in this formation of Timothy's church that the family, the sons and daughters, are the ones that should be taking care, or the children and grandchildren, it says, should be the ones taking care of these people in need. So does that mean we all don't have this burden? No, that's not what that means. Like I said, he's trying to make it clear that it's primarily the immediate family or whatever. And he stresses that in multiple points throughout the first 8 verses or something. And then he goes on to talk about what it means if we're not holding that burden, because at the time it was like Greek law even in certain areas that even, he says here in verse 8, those who won't care for their relatives, especially in their own household, have denied the true faith. Such people are worse than unbelievers. At the time, it was like part of culture, and part of like customs that you take care of your people, and that was even happening for unbelievers, he says. And it was Greek law in a lot of it was Greek law that those people are provided for and cared for. Like, it wasn't okay to like neglect the elders or the widows or whatever. You're supposed to. It was the law. It was the law to take care of them. So if we're not holding that burden or trying to make excuses for not doing it, we are worse than unbelievers, Paul says. In chapter 15 of Matthew, you can flip to that if you want, or I'll read it for you. Chapter 15 of Matthew, I'll read up to verse 8. Jesus teaching about inner purity. Some Pharisees and teachers of religious law now arrived from Jerusalem to see Jesus. They asked him, "Why do your disciples disobey our age-old tradition? For they ignore traditions of ceremonial hand-washing before they eat." Jesus replied, "And why do you, by your traditions, violate the direct commandments of God? For instance, God says, 'Honor your father and mother,' and anyone who speaks disrespectfully of father or mother must be put to death. But you say it is all right for people to say to their parents, 'Sorry, I can't help you, for I have vowed to give to God what I would have given to you.' In this way, you say you don't need to honor your parents, and so you cancel the word of God for the sake of your own traditions." So there was an attitude at the time that once people became, devoted or committed to God, that they didn't need to worry about things that were just a part of culture at the time, and a part of what God even said is pleasing to him. So there's an attitude going on, and this is what Paul is referencing and speaking out against. So we are worse than unbelievers if we have the attitude, like I did when I was first studying this, of not bearing that burden or thinking that it's important, or it's not really important to me right now, or this or that. Because at the time, even the unbelievers were doing this. Were bearing this burden of caring for these women in need. he goes on to talk about this list of qualifications that a widow must meet in order to be taken care of by the church. And this is one of those things that was being set up in order to provide for this unique and specific need at the time. A woman had to do this, and this in order for the church specifically to bear the burden of taking care of this person in the body. Was she always willing to serve? Was she humble? Was she kind to strangers? So on and so forth. This list was, it was like a ministry that was being set up at the time. And if the true widow, or like the desolate woman who had no one to care for her, these were the women that were on these lists. So he says, can be confusing. I don't know if it's confusing when you were reading along, but he says the younger widows should not be on the list because their physical desires will overpower their devotion to Christ and they will want to remarry. They would be guilty of breaking their previous pledge, and if they are on the list, they will learn to be lazy and will spend their time gossiping from house to house, meddling, so on and so forth. I advise these younger widows to marry again. So I don't know if you caught that. At the beginning he says, the younger widows should not be on the list because their physical desires will overpower their devotion and they will want to remarry. So they shouldn't be on the list because they want to remarry. Verse 14. So I advise these younger widows to remarry. What does that mean? That's confusing. So a widow at the time had basically the option or the conviction, I don't know how you want to put it, but once her husband died, it was not uncommon for them to basically devote themselves fully to the church and serving and basically submitting their life to whatever the church needed and serving the body in whatever capacity. And Paul's saying that one of the qualifications on the list is that they be over 60 because they're less likely to have, physical desire or whatever, the temptation, the lust to want to remarry. And so it's kind of like that verse in Corinthians, Paul's opinion of it. He expresses it as like people shouldn't marry because it affects their devotion to Christ, right? He wants people to be fully devoted to Christ. But he makes a concession in his opinion, but if they can't be fully devoted to Christ because they're distracted by this, their want to marry or their lust or whatever, then they should go ahead and do that. So then they can get past that and then commit to devoting themselves to God and to Christ. So that's what Paul's saying here again, only he's putting it in the terms of widows. These younger widows shouldn't be taken care of in the same way by the church at the time because they would be breaking their pledge to Christ. Once they basically committed to being on this list or whatever, that was them saying okay, I'm here to serve and that's what I want my life to be about. Paul's saying that these people shouldn't be on this list because they'll be distracted. And so he says to them, they should just remarry so that they can then take care of the household and have children take care of their own homes. Then the enemy will not be able to say anything about them. So, this is the setup for the women in the church at the time. And then he ends it again here in verse 16. If a widow who is a believer has relatives if a woman who is a believer has relatives who are widows, she must take care of them and not put the responsibility on the church. Then the church can care for the widows who are truly alone. So there's that. So how is this, so there's some context of what was going on in this formation of the church at the time. How is this relevant for us today? It's sort of weird because for the most part in society, we have widows, obviously, but it's not common like it was back then. It's not common for a woman to be married to a man and then they die and then they're without purpose or something, or they're not cared for. back then, the man was the one like providing, solely for the woman. The woman's job was in the household, raising children and caring for their home and so on and so forth. But society and the way like we do things has just sort of changed. So we're not really at a point where the man dies and all of a sudden the woman is lost without purpose and whatever. Like for the most part, yeah, it's just the economy is not the same. So how is this relevant today? Well, look at the way just we treat the elderly people, like in general. Like like some of you guys, Kelsey and Beth and Jen, like you have like firsthand experience with this, and maybe some are not as bad as others, but we have these homes or whatever that are set up, and they're good, they serve a good purpose for like caring for these people, but I mean, you guys can speak to it better because you work in the environment, but how sad is it to like see these people basically dropped off or whatever, and then like maybe the kid or the grandkid or the relative or something will check in once a month or once a year or whatever, but it's really, really heartbreaking, like, and sad. I don't know if you guys have watched the series Whatever Happened to the Human Race, like all the way through, but there's like a silly like cartoon graphic in it at some point where like these two children of this woman, her kids or whatever you would presume, are like wheeling her down this hallway, and they like drop her off, and the woman is like confused, and they like drop her off and in front of like a TV, and then turn away and like give her a kiss on the cheek, and then like that's it. Like that's how we view it today, and we don't own the burden of caring for these people in our families, in our body, or whatever. I know that it's been on. It's relevant to our body like now, and there's some stuff going on. I know Josh has specifically like felt a conviction, but like we look at Aunt Chris, like what are we doing to make sure that we're set up to like care for Chris once she can't do something? She's about to have this knee surgery where she's going to be like incapacitated for I don't know how long, an amount of time. Like, are we thinking about that like now? Like, what are we intentful with someone like Chris in our own body? Like, what are we going to do to go out of our way to make sure that Chris is taken care of, or Chris has what she needs or what she wants even, like, is that something that like we own? In our own families, like, I don't know, you just shared it today, so it's like what I'm thinking about now, but like Kelsey, your grandma, is like going back home, and obviously she has like physical reasons she needs to like go back. She's an old person, she needs to be in a warm climate or whatever. It's just what old people need, but like, it's like situations like that. Like, what do we do to make sure that they don't feel like disconnected? I know it's something that I really struggle with, and this is just a natural consequence of the way that I was raised and stuff that was like forced on me, like moving up here, so having to leave a lot of my family. But my grandparents in California, they get really sad, and it makes me really sad when I think about it. But I don't have an easy time thinking about it. Like, they get sad that I don't call them, So I don't know if you guys think about that or what's your intent. So I have to really try to like just think about calling them, so they don't feel abandoned, and so they know that I love them and whatever. Like I said, that's, I was brought up here when I was like 10, so like that's whatever, and that's something I have to work around to try and like work, to try and make sure I'm doing right by God in that. Like, it's not an excuse, that I live up here or whatever, but am I doing enough in this calling to like care for these people, I think that no is my answer. It's sad, but no. I keep splashing myself when I drink this freaking water. I think about like single moms, they're widows in a sense, if their baby daddy or something like leaves them, like the people in our lives that we know like that, like again, like my sister, she lives in Idaho. She's a single mom because her baby daddy like walked out on her. How do we view these people, I know that coming soon or whatever, and it's been on the mind of the leadership of Aletheia for a while, but our like SMILE program, I know like people like Wendy were involved in it for a time, but like we have these things that the church is trying to put into place, but like how do we take care of these people that we know and are in our lives? Like are we intentful with them and whatever? Are there people in our direct families that are like that we could be doing more to help support and provide for them? Yeah, just society now, it just views it as like a bother. It's like they can't be productive in society anymore, so we'll like ship these people off, and that sucks. That's just part of life. They can't. What is the contribute? But what's the term? Social contract theory. They can't give back to us, so they're useless to us. So here you go, elder, home, or whatever. Please take care of my whatever. And then they brush their hands off of it and maybe call once a year. But are we doing enough? Do we know people like this? Are there people in our family? Are there people in our body, like I said, Aunt Chris, that we should be thinking about now because she's about to have this thing, in the future because you're just getting old, Rose and Dinah, I really commend the Filipino culture because it's just those people they look out for their own, but it's not easy for me, and it's just I'm a product of the generation we're raised up in here, and then just my personality, but I look back there sometimes and I'm like, that's awesome, and I hope someone take care of me when I'm old, that's yeah. How are we being servants of these people? I mentioned it just briefly before, but David calls God in Psalms 68 or something. David calls him a defender of widows. Christ himself, as he's traveling about, sees this woman grieving and wants to help her because her son died. I forget the city. I think it starts with a Z. It's a weird name. But he sees this woman grieving and he feels this heavy compassion. And so Christ performs a miracle because of what he sees and raises the son. So how are we serving these people? How are we compassionate for them? What are we doing to set up things here or in our families to make sure that these people are provided for and their needs are being met? So that's a question. Another question is, what do you think, brainstorm a ministry that you think that can be created to be intentful about this and active. We're a relatively young body, but it is, look around and there are at least a few people who are approaching this age where, they're not going to be able to work or something. How are we setting up something in our body because we're called to by God to care for these people? We have things that the government sets up, like Medicare or Medicaid or whatever, and and those have good purposes for caring for these individuals, but it's like our burden, It's not the government's burden, and we shouldn't be just okay with what they're doing, Like, we should feel a heavy, burden and compassion for these specific people. We shouldn't just be okay with the government doing it or whatever. Like, what are we doing as a body and as followers of Christ to think about these people?